Okay, let's go ahead and get started, and people can join as they when they're ready. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name, if we haven't met, my name is Eleni Fisher. I'm an associate managing director at Ideas 42, and joined today by my teammate Michael Herman and by Tony Bowen, who is the executive director of the Fidelity Charitable Catalyst Fund. And we're really looking forward to sharing some learnings today from a project that we're wrapping up after about 2 years of working with a number of different national donor advised funds and community foundations to design and test out some tools with the goal of encouraging donor advised fund giving to community-based organizations. So, a quick overview of what we'll talk about today. Shortly, I'll turn it over to Tony to tee up this question or the problem that we're focusing on, giving to community-based organizations and why that matters. Then we'll talk more about what it means to look at a problem like this through a behavioral lens and share more about this project, what we did, and some of the solutions came out of it. So Michael will share those solutions and some of the results, preliminary results from some partnerships we had with donor advised funds to test some of these ideas out over the course of the project. We'll turn it back to Tony briefly to hear about some of the other work that the Catalyst Fund is doing to encourage local giving before leaving some time for Q&A. If you have questions while we're talking, please feel free to drop them either in the chat or in the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll hopefully have time to get to those at the end. Okay. If you're not familiar with Ideas 42, here's a very quick overview of our organization. Ideas 42 is a nonprofit. We use insights from the study of human behavior to understand context and improve the effectiveness of programs, products, systems, and policies across the social impact sector. So we work in a number of different issue areas like education and health and economic justice. The team that Michael and I work on and we'll be talking about today is our work in the philanthropic sector. So in this space specifically, we use Ideas 42's behavioral methodology, which we'll be sharing a little bit more about in a little bit. We use it to better understand donors and the context in which they're making their giving decisions and work to redesign those contexts to make it easier for donors to give generously and intentionally to impactful organizations, something typically donors already want to do, but sometimes have some challenges in doing that. So we do this work in part by working directly with those who influence donor decision making, which I think probably many of you joining us today would fall into that category. We work with you all to test out some of these insights and designs. And we've been fortunate enough to partner with the Catalyst Fund at Fidelity Charitable over the past 2.5 years on a project to design solutions for DAF donors to give to community-based organizations. So I'm going to turn it over to Tony now to share a little bit more about the Catalyst Fund and their mission and the problem they're trying to address. So Tony, over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Eleni and Michael, for having me today. For those of you who I haven't had a chance to meet, I have the honor of managing the Fidelity Charitable Catalyst Fund, which is a grant-making program of Fidelity Charitable. It's led by our board of trustees, and it's separate from our donor advised fund program. Today, I'm going to be focusing most of my insights on our Catalyst Fund grant-making work as opposed to our DAF work. A little bit about us. So the Catalyst Fund, we make grants to intermediaries that inspire donors to give more to promising community-based organizations. And we elevate nonprofits to build their muscle and confidence to find and retain donors. We have a lot of our grantees on the call today, so really grateful that you made the time. I first got to know Ideas 42 when I started in this role 5 years ago. I wasn't quite sure what behavioral science was and why it mattered to philanthropy. So in 2023, I spent some cozy days around Christmas reading the book Nudge. We'll see if it shows up here. You can see the title here. It's about improving decisions about health, wealth, and happiness. And then it all became clear to me why the work of Ideas 42 was so critical. Nudge is about how we make choices and how we can make better ones. Giving to nonprofits is a set of choices we as humans make, right? We choose which nonprofits to give to, how much to give, and if we should repeat the gift. And so, if our goal at the Catalyst Fund and for so many of you is to inspire donors to give more to local nonprofits, then this is in essence a behavioral science problem, right? How do we influence and empower donors to make different decisions related to giving that align a donor's goals and values with community needs? So let's dive more into why the Catalyst Fund cares about moving more funding to local community-based nonprofits. So as you'll see on the next slide, we analyzed a lot of data on where philanthropy flows from foundations, corporations, and donor-advised funds. Simply put, philanthropic dollars are not reaching the communities that need them the most. If we think about what holds back a community from thriving that so many nonprofits and donors are trying to work on, think poverty, economic mobility, health, and children and family well-being, then what we see is that the states with the lowest outcomes here in the United States, those states actually receive 2 times less funding per capita than the states with the highest outcomes. And the gap is even bigger among DAF donors. Likewise, nonprofits across the country that serve communities of color receive 3% of philanthropic funding, even though they comprise 44% of our population. And rural communities receive 3.5% of philanthropic funding while making up about 20% of the population. So this means that the nonprofits that are serving our most disadvantaged communities lack access to the resources needed to fill gaps and deepen their impact. Right? Ideally, we'd flip the equation, right? We'd be giving 2 times more money to these communities so that they can work to improve their communities. But at the same time, we know that donors want to make an impact, right? But they often aren't connecting to nonprofits in these communities. They might instead be connecting to larger nonprofits because of personal experiences. Think about your alma mater or a hospital, or because of robust marketing and fundraising efforts. It's who donors are familiar with. Also, most donors don't have access to engaging learning opportunities or philanthropic guidance, and that can cause a disconnect between their values and the causes that they want to support or where they actually give. Look, I do this for a living, and my giving fell into this pattern as well. In 2023, when we adapted this new strategy, I went through my DAF to see where I had been recommending grants. And my top grants were to where I went to college and where I went to grad school. And so I had to do some personal reflection to say, well, if I really care about community-based organizations, about LGBTQ issues, about social justice issues, then I needed to understand how to better align my own giving. And I've been working the last few years to do that. In fact, if you look at studies on DAF donors, Giving Compass did a study that showed that 57% of DAF donors reported that their last donation went to national nonprofits because they didn't know where to find local effective organizations. And lastly, what we've seen in the data is that not enough people are asked to give or are stewarded who could support nonprofits in these communities on an ongoing basis. Now, as folks inside the nonprofit sector, you might think this statistic is wild, but according to Giving Tuesday, only 50% of people remember being asked to give to a nonprofit in the last year. Right? So that leaves an estimated $19 billion to $46 billion in annual support that could be unlocked, according to Giving Tuesday's analysis. So looking ahead a little bit deeper into some Fidelity Charitable data when it comes to smaller organizations, we've looked at the revenue size of organizations, and at the Catalyst Fund, I tend to look at data for small to mid-size organizations. So that would be budgets of 200,000 to 5 million. And we often see that those organizations are community-led and community-driven and more likely to solve community issues. We see that since the Catalyst Fund launched our strategy in 2023, Fidelity Charitable donors are giving more to smaller nonprofits. That's awesome, right? Almost $1 billion more, or 54% since we started. But that still only represents 15% of all of our grant making, which means that larger organizations are still receiving the overwhelming majority of resources. For this budget size of organizations around the US, they represent about 24%, right? So we've got a gap to close there where donors could be recommending more grants to these small to mid-sized organizations. So that's on the budget size. Let's talk a little bit about location when we talk about local here at the Catalyst Fund. So we recently looked at a lot of data and we created an index that ranks all 50 states by quality of life outcomes, funding disparities from philanthropy, how much local giving infrastructure exists to build bridges between donors and nonprofits, such as, say, the operating budgets of community foundations or state associations of nonprofits that might be providing capacity building. And then we also looked at the potential of individual donors to give more locally. And what we saw is that there were 13 states in the Southwest, Deep South, and Central Appalachia that were the states where more funding was needed and where giving could grow if intermediaries received more support. Nonprofits in these states only receive 14% of funding, despite being 27% of the US population. And that should be enough for us to want to rally to bring more funding there. But as I mentioned, these are also the states where we see the lowest quality of life outcomes. So this really helps us better understand where donors could make more of a difference with their giving and where more infrastructure could be built to support this work. So that's enough data for me for now. I'm really excited that you're here today to learn more about the work from Ideas 42, to understand how to motivate donors to give more to local community-based nonprofits. And so I'll turn it back over to the Ideas 42 team.
Thanks, Tony, for laying that out so well. Before we get into the specifics of this project, I wanted to provide a little bit of background for you all on what it means to apply a behavioral lens to a problem. What do we do here at Ideas 42? So this slide depicts the standard model of human behavior that you might find in a traditional economics textbook if you ever took economics in school at any point. So it's very linear, as you can see, and very rational, right? People weigh the costs and the benefits of their action, and if the benefits outweigh the costs, then they take the action necessary to get the outcome that they desire. So if this model were accurate, an accurate way to understand people's behavior, you'd be able to infer preferences pretty easily by observing outcomes. So for example, you would if you know someone that has a college degree, you would be able to infer that that person weighed the costs and benefits of going to college and getting a diploma, and then weighed those trade-offs, decided to apply and enroll in college and complete the coursework needed to get their degree. And you could assume that anyone who does not have a degree made the opposite decision, right? They decided that those benefits wouldn't outweigh the costs and that it wasn't worth it for them. But in this is just one example, right? We know that's not always the case, and people's final actions are not always revealing of what their preferences or intentions actually are. So it's these kinds of more reductive conclusions that first sparked the behavioral revolution. And we know our behavior is a lot more complicated than those simple cost benefit analysis models. And behavioral scientists say things like our behavior depends on the context, and we point that out that our brains are processing a lot of information all at once, and we can't pay attention to all of it. And we often take mental shortcuts. So sometimes that can lead people to think that this is the model we're proposing instead. That's really chaotic and really random. But we really think actually behavior is more predictable than this, and somewhere in between that really linear model and this very much not linear model that you're seeing here. And the ultimate goal of behavioral science is to chart a way through that middle space, build models that allow us to recognize patterns in this mess of human behavior. So let's talk about the context of giving and specifically giving through your donor advised fund to understand what about the context might enable giving to community-based organizations and what might make it more challenging. So the context that we're working in for this project is donor advised funds. And when we started this project, we had done a number of other projects with DAOs before, but none specifically about local giving. So we wanted to understand what are donors' preferences or intentions around local giving, and how can the DAF support them in that. And Tony mentioned already some surveys and studies that have been done by partners in the field, and here's a few other on the right side of this slide that show that donors really do want to support local and smaller organizations in their community, and that we know an increasing number of people have donor advised funds, so DAFs are a great channel for supporting community-based giving. And thinking about the donor journey or the context of giving, the points along the path, there are different ways that behavioral science can help donors to fulfill their intentions and make for a more seamless granting project process. And different barriers come up at different points in the journey. So even from the early stages of just thinking about giving or thinking about wanting to make a different gift, how can we capture donors' attention when they might not be thinking about giving, and get them to think more deeply about it? And how can we provide recommendations or help that research and discovery process be easier for donors so that they're not overwhelmed by options and actually excited about their giving? Once they've decided to support an organization within their donors advised fund, how can we make it share information within their portal to make that grant process easy, quick, and also supportive of the nonprofit that's ultimately receiving the funds? And then beyond that initial decision of making that grant, or the many decisions that go into that, how can we share information back with donors over the long run about their giving activity to help them build their identity as a donor and help them make adjustments or set goals so that they are really giving in a way that's aligned with what their intentions are, particularly in this case related to giving in their communities. And when we started this project, we did a diagnosis phase where we did a lot of desk research and interviews with subject matter experts and people that work at donor advised funds and nonprofits as well to understand what barriers felt the most prevalent in this particular question. And so we found really a lot of the barriers are the same that you would expect for a donor, whether they have a donor advised fund or not. And these on this slide, we have some of the most prevalent barriers that came out of that diagnosis phase. So on that research and discovery side, people aren't always thinking about giving, despite I know everyone here probably is always thinking about giving, but many people are not. So how can we help those smaller organizations break through and capture the attention of donors who might only be seeing information from better resourced organizations who have more time and more marketing to get their names out there and increase recognition. And we also found that a lot of donors, when they're learning about organizations in their communities, are are primarily supporting organizations that they already have a connection to or that a friend recommended to them. And they often are making decisions about what organizations they want to support beyond that based on different kind of constructs or evaluative mental models that they have in their mind. And sometimes those can use updating, for example, particularly when it comes to smaller organizations that might not be able to provide all of the data and details that donors are used to seeing about nonprofits. When it comes to picking an organization, even in one city or town, there are often many organizations to support, and it can be hard to decide which organization or set of organizations a donor might actually want to end up supporting. And don't we also found that donors, when making new or supporting new organizations, often do a kind of a trial approach where they are supporting an organization through a smaller gift or a set of smaller gifts, or maybe attending an event or a volunteer opportunity first to learn a bit more before they commit to making a financial monetary gift. And lastly, this is not a donor behavior, but we did hear a lot of feedback from nonprofits that they're still really learning about how to connect with donor advised funds and with DAF donors. And there's a lot that fits under this category. So things like how to best steward relationships with them, with those donors, if they should be doing any sort of special marketing to them or have special programming, to the more nuts and bolts of how to track DAF donations in within the nonprofit CRM or however they're managing their fundraising data. So there's still a bit of learning that's being done by nonprofits, particularly these smaller organizations that maybe are not receiving so many DAF gifts yet, quite yet. So after we did that diagnosis phase and identified these top barriers, we hosted a series of co-design sessions with participants from several national DAFs and community foundations to think about how we could address some of those barriers within the DAF context. So we generated over 100 ideas of different programs, services, and tools that DAF platforms could offer to their fund holders that could encourage community-based giving, many of which you'll find in the design catalog, which we'll share at the end. And the designs primarily fell into three different strategies. So the first is strategic calls to action, really bringing donor attention to opportunities to give, and within those opportunities, giving locally. Offering just-in-time tools and guidance on the DAF platform, to that can be onboarding materials or beyond to create giving habits that are supportive of nonprofits more generally. And finally, providing custom recommendations to help with choice overload and offer validation and build trust. And so all of these strategies can help donors break out of their status quo of giving to only to their alma mater, or only to the bigger organizations that they already know, by offering them new organizations to support. So before I turn it over to Michael to share a little bit more detail about each of those design strategies, we're going to do a little activity. You can use your phone to join this Mentimeter word cloud through the QR code, or you can go online, and Julia will drop the link in the chat as well if that's easier for you to just click straight through. And you should be able and if you could try to keep your responses to be just 1 to 3 words so that they will show up in the word cloud. Hopefully it will be smart enough to generate. um, and you can submit multiple responses too. So what information do donors most often want, the donors you interact with, before they're making a gift to a community-based organization? We're seeing impact is big. So I think more than one person maybe has said impact. Accountability, trust, who the gift is going to, how can I trust them, what is the impact, mission clarity. Oh, it's hard to keep track of all these as they're moving around. Oh, this is great. Sustainability, connection, impact data. So I mean, what I'm seeing here is that donors are really looking for really clear examples of what an organization is doing in the community, and who they're serving and where, and maybe examples of how that organization is developing trust within their community and with their donors. Okay, we have one more question. So that was about what donors want to see, and then the next question is how do donors actually see that impact once they are engaging with community-based foundations or community-based organizations, sorry, in their community. Volunteering and relationships, storytelling, impact reports, site visits, personal experience, external communications, media. Most don't bother. Claude. That's new. I have a feeling that's going to be showing up. If we did this again in like 2 months, that will probably be one of the bigger words. Word of mouth. Yep. Program officers. Cool. They don't. Yeah. I still see people are still answering. Thank you all so much for sharing all these one-on-one. I think this is the one thing that I'm seeing here that I think is great. The most special thing about supporting organizations in your community or in other communities is that you are able to develop those more close relationships than you might with a larger or more nationally focused nonprofit, and actually attend events and go to site visits. Okay. Feel free to keep answering. We can come back to this, but I'm gonna turn the slides over to Michael, and he's gonna share some examples of what we worked on um, in the design phase of this project. Over to you, Michael.
Great. Thanks, Lenny. And thanks, Tony. Hi, everyone. So we've talked about behavioral barriers and the design concepts that came out of this work. So now let's talk more about what these might look like in the field. And those responses, I'll echo Eleni's sentiments there, are really great. And you'll see a few of those ideas reflected, I think, in the following examples. So let's move to the first one. So, as Lenny mentioned, strategic calls to action seek to amplify desired giving behaviors at key moments of donor attention. And this includes capturing attention within existing behaviors, but can also include creating new moments of attention, which can help folks support community-based organizations when they're most available to it. So, a call to action can come in many forms besides a simple prompt to give, of course. But what does the word strategic mean in this case? And it's helpful to have open-mindedness about what constitutes a moment of attention here. So, for example, looking at that dashboard sample on the right, what do you notice? So, first, perhaps, is the the banner at the top, highlighting local giving day, and that's tied to a prompt to give, donate now, off to the right. So there's actually kind of two moments of attention here. There's the typical act of logging in and finding yourself on a landing page, but then there's also this larger moment, a local giving day, or something like a commemorative month or crisis relief, perhaps, that then complements that moment. So, other opportunities for strategic moments of attention can include things like embedding local nonprofits into default discovery pathways. So, for example, a DAF website or a portal landing page. You can embed community-based organizations into search results, and that can include chat-based search. Somebody mentioned Claude earlier, and I'm sure we'll be seeing more of that, right? And then you can also help elevate local organizations as top results. You might also have a featured placement of a local nonprofit or nonprofits on platforms. And you may also have a third-party curator of community-based organizations. So, for example, in partnership or through a sponsorship by a community foundation or a local expert. And this can help address the underlying behavioral barriers like experiencing choice overload and limited attention, right, by having those strategic calls to action. And this design concept is appropriate for many, many channels. But for instance, some popular ones here might include things like in-portal tools, so guided search, on-platform resources like lists. You might expand outside of the virtual space to in-person events, but also, of course, virtual events. There's email marketing and crowdfunding campaigns would be pretty reliable channels through which to apply strategic calls to action. So, a specific example from the field from this work is in collaboration with a regional foundation, we developed a cohort program to focus donor attention on a single issue and then on a single community-based organization. So, what we did in partnership with this foundation was invite the foundation's network to help shape a new kind of experience, and then sent a personalized invitation to join a small local cohort that was supposed to focus on learning and engaging through conversation. We also asked the invitees to share what they'd like to come out of those sessions. So that sought to increase buy-in and attendance for that first session. Now, during the first session, participants completed a personal action plan, and that created a participatory process to select the nonprofit that they would then go on to support. Attendees shared their interests and their concerns, and then the foundation, using all of that information, ultimately selected a nonprofit. right? So this activity, the personal action plan, guaranteed action in the session, but it also created a commitment device in the form of a plan to take subsequent action moving forward. Now, half of the invitees attended the first session, and then half of those opted into a second session, which was a conversation with the nonprofit itself. And qualitative feedback from that second session indicated that donors wanted to see more success stories from the sector and from that nonprofit. And that teed up a follow-on call to action, which was meeting in person and deepening the relationship. 75% of those who attended opted into a subsequent site visit with the nonprofit. And I saw site visits come up earlier in the word cloud. Right. So the main takeaway from this implementation is that by chaining the calls of action together at the right moments and also kind of building a community along the way, that foundation can provide tailored giving opportunities while the nonprofit can focus more of its resources and time on cultivating new donor relationships. So strategic calls to action in this case look nothing like the dashboard example on the prior slide, but this field test highlights why an open-mindedness around what a moment of attention is can be so important and how you can introduce calls to action along the way. The second design concept that Eleni introduced is just-in-time tools or just-in-time guidance. And just-in-time guidance refers to a set of tools and resources that are served up right when the, we'll say, user needs them. So these resources aim to help DAF holders build new habits that shift mental models of what it means to be a DAF holder and what they can do. So, for example, a DAF holder has the power to help develop a stronger and more consistent ecosystem for community-based organizations, for instance, through setting up recurring grants, creating some predictability and building a relationship. Now, these just-in-time tools and resources also aim to make the process easier for the nonprofit. So, for instance, guidance on how to simplify the recording of gifts and also managing donor relationships. So these resources are all meant to be tailored to different audiences, right? So for example, guidance that's responsive to the differences between a new fund holder versus an existing fund holder, right? And that can make the giving experience more engaging and more fulfilling because it's aligned with that person's intentions and their role, right? Where they are in their giving. Now, maybe a helpful context to think about just-in-time guidance is through onboarding, which all of us in one way or another are familiar with, be it through DAF platforms or really any other sorts of platforms. Those new to a DAF relationship might need to take several actions before recommending any grants, right? And that can introduce certain hassle factors along the way. But by introducing just-in-time guidance and choice architecture, can help facilitate that process in a way that directs attention where it's needed at the right moment. So the sample on this slide, for instance, shows a guide for relationship managers, which is to say just-in-time guidance is not always facing the donor or the fund holder. It's meant more to help empower whoever it is that can move the intended action towards being a fulfilled behavior, right? So some channels for just-in-time guidance may commonly include things like welcome emails, perhaps how-to guides, including for discovery, also for advisors or provider engagement, maybe something like a legacy planning prompt, right? There are many different cases where a just-in-time tool could direct attention the right way and also help alleviate some of maybe the burdens of hassles or a complex choice architecture or overload. So looking to a field example here, to demonstrate this, we developed a complementary onboarding guide, similar to what you got the flavor of in the last slide. And this onboarding guide sought to support new fund holders by revamping the experience that they had and the also relationship manager experience. So we also produced a matching incentive here, you'll see, for new fund holders that encouraged early and intentional action. So there's kind of two elements of this intervention. And the intervention starts to help the fund holder build momentum and feel good about their giving early on, right? That matching incentive helps there, but also guides the relationship manager to focus on particular actions at a particular time. So for example, simply introducing the idea of giving to a community-based organization is not necessarily something that would come automatically to the mind of a relationship manager. But there's other examples of this too. So keeping meetings focused and not overwhelming, ensuring that communication preferences are aligned with the preferences of the donor. This guide helps bring into the fore For the RM, what would be helpful tactics to engage the donor and actually help them make the first step, maybe the most important step, to then build momentum. And I'll add here, you see some numbers. Those who use the match predominantly gave to local organizations. So the guidance to the relationship manager helped focus attention toward local organizations, and the incentive match helped new fund holders actually take that first action, right? And that produced a good feeling for both the fund holder as well as the RM, right? It helped them facilitate the desired action. And we can move on to the third one here, which is custom community-based organization recommendations. So DAF providers occupy a unique position to help donors navigate an increasingly crowded landscape. DAF providers sit right at the point of donor intent, contribution and grant making history, platform design, right? So they're well situated to help donors cut through choice overload and turn toward action. They have a lot of information and occupy a certain nexus of the donor experience. So, for example, you can leverage existing data to allow DAP sponsors to share relevant recommendations at moments when donors are most likely to give. Alternatively, the DAP sponsor can create a new moment, a fresh start moment, like creating a year-end giving or acknowledging a major life transition to encourage donors to revisit their goals, right? And turn maybe lapsed or latent intentions into real grant-making activity. So on the right here, right, recommendations like these can be made through a matching engine. You can factor in donor signals and local orgs. So on the donor side, things like past giving history, location, search behavior, other inputs can then be assessed against nearby nonprofits, smaller equivalents of national organizations, or cause-aligned organizations to help enhance the donor interface and focus attention and choice onto a few things that are likely to align with what the donor is looking to do. Other implementations of custom recommendations might be based on a past gift or the organization that's currently in the donor's quote unquote cart. You can also highlight local nonprofits that are doing similar work to a larger organization and suggest that as an add-on donation to what's already in the donor's quote unquote cart. Another example also could be something like a tipping model to support local organizations, right? Either through a fund, perhaps bundling. And these recommendations are most likely a fit for checkout flows. You can have pop-ups that include testimonials or suggestions. If you're visiting a nonprofit rating page, right, that's another opportunity to say, this organization is doing work like this. And there's also messages of social proof here as well. You can have an opportunity, for instance, surfacing the percentage of other donors who have added something to the cart or had an add-on donation or supported locally recently. So looking at another field example for this concept, we tested this concept by working with DAF sponsors to develop an offering where fund holders were invited to share their giving preferences either by email or by phone. And that provided a level of personalization that could meet different donors where they are. So some recipients of this were invited to complete a questionnaire about their preferences on their own and click through and just do that sort of self-service, right? Do it individually. The other group were invited to complete the questionnaire with one-on-one support from the DAF sponsor. And then about 3 weeks later, all participants received personalized lists of recommended organizations via email and in their donor portal. So both of these paths produced meaningful grant making and more satisfied donation activity. Now, more self-service donors clicked through to the intake form, but fewer actually completed it. Right? So for these donors, their curiosity was piqued by the offering, but not all of them were able to dedicate the time to complete it. However, the group that was supported in the one-on-one phone call, those donors both followed through more and gave at a higher rate. And I'll add, you might know this on those numbers there. We did ask donors who did not participate also to share their feedback. So 71% of donors who did not participate said that they already knew who they were going to donate to, so they didn't need the service. But interestingly, if you look at those numbers, you'll notice that both conditions had the same number of donors, but the supported donors gave twice as many gifts, which is to say multiple gifts per person. So one reason an intervention like this could be valuable is that one individual might support multiple new organizations. So curation can support not only giving, but also discovery as well, which we were pleased to see through the evidence here. So all three of the design concepts and tests we've shared here generally orient around an individual. However, like we saw demonstrated through the cohort pilot, giving is hardly a solo act, right? Giving itself, maybe pushing the button, is often done individually, but it happens in a social environment. You've got DAF holders, national DAF sponsors, community foundations, community-based organizations, other donors in people's networks. All of these may play an influential role in decision making, and subtly so. So these are just a few design ideas that seek to overcome the behavioral barriers that we've discussed through a lens of collaboration, what you see on the slide here. So other ideas like working with influential community members, convening interest groups or learning groups, sharing testimonials through unique channels, all of these can also promote local giving. These three reflection questions at the bottom, which are also included in the design catalog, can help prompt some creative thinking about the donor's social context, and what new ideas might emerge based on their relationship to other people or other parties in the decision making and grant making process. Now, the last thing I'll share here is that we have learned quite a lot from partnering with DAFs for experimentation over the years, including the challenges that we've encountered along the way. So, another thing we've included in the design catalog is a readiness worksheet. So, this worksheet aims to help your organization assess whether the conditions are in place to design, pilot, and evaluate a new donor-facing or nonprofit-facing intervention or tool. Now, there are several categories in this worksheet. So, for example, donor intentions and behavior, what you see on the screen here, technical and data infrastructure readiness. There's several different categories. And altogether, it focuses on your readiness, focuses on risk tolerance, it focuses on implementation capacity. It does not focus on the merit of the idea itself, right? Just on whether or not you're ready to give it a shot. And there's a scoring mechanism. So once you've scored your responses, there are a few reflection questions at the bottom to help determine what maybe you can do to most effectively move the needle on readiness, where your organization might benefit from some more preparation in advance. And with that covered, I will pass it back to Tony.
Great. Thanks so much, Michael. And I appreciate seeing all the specific examples in that worksheet as well, so folks can apply what they learned today. So let me jump back a little bit into some of our reflections. We've been doing this work for 3 years now to try to get donors to give more to priority communities. And what we did to sort of start our reflection is we looked back at the types of donors that might want to give to local organizations and to communities of color and rural communities. And then, what are the levers that intermediaries that our grantees are using to engage these donors? So we had a catalog of sort of different options and different approaches. So we really see three ways to motivate donors to give more to local nonprofits. And sometimes it can be helpful to segment your approach. So the first is the most obvious, right, which is backyard giving. These are donors who already live in these communities, but could give more to local nonprofits. And this could potentially be because they haven't been asked, right? I cited that stat earlier. They may not know about local nonprofits, or they're giving local nonprofits smaller grants than other nonprofits that they tend to give to. This idea of being able to tap more local giving, it's actually, this is more frequent than you might think. So at Fidelity Charitable, about 54% of our grants and 38% of grant dollars stay within a donor's home state. So certainly, it's the majority, but there's a lot of potential to do even more local giving. What we've seen work well for donors through the Catlyst Fund grantees in particular has been engaging in giving circles where people can learn about local nonprofits as a group, giving days for a specific location or community, promoting Giving Tuesday, local events and site visits, putting out giving guides, and then curated lists that a donor can see to understand different nonprofits that they might want to get to know within causes that they care about. The next group of donors to think about for more local giving would be through national redistribution. So this focuses on getting donors, no matter where they live, to give to national groups that in turn re-grant money out to local nonprofits. And so one example of that would be, for example, Decolonizing Wealth Project, right? They educate donors through their Liberated Capital program Donors pay a membership. I'm personally a member. And then the DWP team works with community advisors to redistribute those funds to grassroots organizations, right? First Nations Development Institute. They raise money all across the country to support Native-led nonprofits and tribal governments, regranting out a significant amount of those funds that they raise. Another example and type of donor to consider here would be those who have outsider ties. So how do organizations connect to donors who have moved away, who have family, or who spend part of their year in the community? Right? Women's Foundation of Alabama, for example, they run a giving program for women who no longer live in the state to give to scholarships for young women that are living in Alabama. The Women's Foundation of the South, they raise money from women all across the country with family ties to the South to then support local nonprofits that are based in the South, improving well-being. In the last 3 years here at Fidelity Charitable, we've tried a variety of ways to connect our donors to the work of the Catlyst Fund grantees, really to set up experiments to see what we could learn. And you'll see a little bit more of those examples here on the next slide. So we offered free philanthropic advising with Give Team to our mid-level donors that were based in our priority states. That's an example of trying to promote backyard giving, right? We were able to do that for about 50 donors. And we saw donors give close to around $300,000 in new money to local nonprofits as a result. We invite local donors to come to events and giving opportunities that are offered by community foundations or to learn more about giving circles. We also help sponsor 2 nonprofit film festivals where nonprofits got to do video storytelling about their work. And it really made giving engaging and fun. We did a national webinar with Philanthropy Together in Philanos on giving circles to help DAF donors understand what a giving circle is. And we included a $500 match to join a giving circle after. And we also have provided guidance to donors on who they can support after a disaster. So for example, after the Central Texas flooding last year, we piloted a matching program to match donations to the Community Foundation of Texas Hill Country. Our grantees, as you'll see on the bottom half of this list, they did a lot of experiments as well and new efforts to try to engage DAF donors. So some of our lessons learned from this work. So we worked with Ideas 42 to actually help us craft some of the emails to donors to keep messaging compelling and simple and creating a little bit of a sense of urgency to get donors to take action. I'll say I wrote the draft of these emails often, and those final emails were not necessarily exactly the language I would have picked. But I really enjoyed seeing the tweaks that Ideas 42 made to incorporate behavioral science techniques. We also found that using donor testimonials really helped with higher response rates. And donors really liked events where they got to meet other donors and nonprofits in the same room. Several of these offerings included either a curated list or a group of nonprofits that presented 8 to 12 nonprofits. For example, those film festivals, that's about the size that those film festivals had. And that way a donor got to know a lot of different types of nonprofits across cause areas. And in a lot of our cases where our grantees were offering up curated lists, this led to new funding for many of these organizations. We also found that the matching opportunity that we did, it did more than just talk about the match itself. It was a signal, right? Us saying and highlighting that a community foundation is someone that you can give to after a disaster opened up some of our donors' eyes that they didn't not have to just give to big national organizations. They could also give to a local community foundation. So donors felt more confident to grant there. And I'll say on the Giving Circle front, we have found that this one takes a little bit more time, right? When you're joining a Giving Circle, it's more than just a one-time donation. And so it takes a certain type of donor who wants to give collectively and be in learning mode, but the payoff is great, right? Most people stay in Giving Circles on average for 7 years. I'm going to share a little bit more quantitative data on what we've been seeing has been working for driving more money to local community-based organizations. So we ask all of our grantees who work with donors to report back on how much funding they think they influence donors to give to promising nonprofits with budgets under $5 million. And then we ask how much they spent doing it, right? What was sort of our version of return on investment? And when we looked at our data from the last couple of years, we found that platforms such as Every.org, Just Fund, Charity Navigator, along with giving days, giving circles, and those who raise and re-grant money had really solid ratios, right? Meaning they're able to inspire a lot more giving than it costs them to do that work. Not surprisingly, donor education alone doesn't lead to more money, but we see that when it's part of a larger plan and it's combined with other levers, it can help draw a donor in and increase their confidence before they actually make a donation. What was interesting is when we looked at some of the offerings that were in the middle leverage ratios, we actually saw that these have a higher chance of shifting a donor's behavior from their status quo, right? So giving money to a fund that re-grants to grassroots groups will almost always mean that a donor ends up supporting a group that they wouldn't have known before, right? For example, I support the LGBTQ Fund of Mississippi, which in turn grants to 11 local organizations. There is no way I would independently choose to give to all those groups. I wouldn't know how to get to know them. Likewise, we see that intentional one-on-one philanthropic advising can lead to new nonprofits being put in front of donors for them to consider. So as you're listening to this and you consider the worksheet that Michael talked about, I encourage you to sketch out what is the behavior change that you're hoping that the intervention you might want to try will create. And then actually look back at your data to see if it will lead to more giving. A lot of you work at DAF sponsors or on platforms, so you have access to some of that data. Are you hoping that donors will increase their knowledge with the intervention that you have? Will they give to new organizations? Will they give more to the same nonprofits? Or will they renew their giving? And then see if the giving changes. And across all the levers our grantees and we use with donors to inspire more local giving, I've really seen that curation or personalization for a donor can help break through many of the options available. Seamless event registration, that can get donors across the finish line. Matching funding, we've talked about that a couple of times today. That can de-risk giving alone. It signals importance and can create a sense of urgency with a deadline. And peer referrals and timely campaigns can really help from a behavioral science perspective as well. So as you craft your next donor engagement opportunity, see if there's a way to experiment with one of these and see what you learn. So I'm going to close out with a few more insights from our grantees. I hit on a number of these already, so to be mindful of time, I'm going to talk a little bit about number 1 and number 6. So the importance of storytelling. So what our grantees have reported back to us is that storytelling, when it's tailored to a nonprofit's strengths, needs, and sound business practices, can be a powerful motivator for donors. When we did the survey, we saw that impact data was also something that was highlighted. So grantees that emphasize the value of highlighting an organization's distinct contributions and impact within the sector really helps donors clearly understand the gap that their support will fill. It helps them understand the solutions that the nonprofit provides and the difference that their gift can make. For example, smaller organizations can emphasize that a donor's gift may go further, right? As they are often perceived as being able to achieve more with fewer resources. Now, as a sector, we may want to push back on some of those narratives, but we also want to make sure that today we're working with donors to drive more resources to smaller nonprofits. We've also seen that nonprofits can increase urgency by telling their storytelling and putting them in the context of current events and framing giving opportunities around specific time-bound needs. That could be around closing an immediate funding gap or supporting a defined number of community members. So then on number 6, what we've seen with our grantees is that, and it really reflects one of the top concerns that I have, is that we're doing all this work to connect donors to local nonprofits. But the question becomes, will the donors renew support, right? Will the nonprofit have the capacity to try to build an authentic relationship with the donor, bring the donor in as a potential champion, share their impact, and then request additional support? Donors are often used to, we have to remember, the stewardship that they receive from much larger institutions, right? Universities, hospitals, art museums, and international NGOs. I actually still keep a coaster that I designed as a university fundraiser on my desk that we would send to loyal donors. Smaller nonprofits don't always have the capacity to do this, right? And so, one of the things that I encourage you all who work with donors is see if there are ways to better connect donors to the nonprofits that they're supporting. At Fidelity Charitable, we actually default, right? Defaults are a behavioral science term. We default our grant recommendations that a donor is making so that they are offering their name, fund name, and address. The donor has to take the extra step to remove this information. And we get really great results from this. 95% of our grants have account information and 80% have an address. So wherever you can reasonably do to encourage connection between donors and nonprofits can really go a long way. So those are some of our insights that we shared as we've been doing more work to encourage local giving. And I'm going to turn things back over to the Ideas 42 team to close us out.
Thanks so much, Tony. It's been a pleasure. I can't believe that we are already nearly at the bottom of the hour, the end of the hour. So we just wanted to close up with a few quick links and housekeeping things. We would love to stay in touch if we haven't met before. Michael and I, you can find our email addresses here on the left and the landing page for our civil society team at Ideas 42, which is the team that works on philanthropy and other types of civic engagement like volunteering. And so we'd love to be in touch and hear about your work and if there's anything that we can provide you with. And a lot of our resources of other previous reports that we've done and blog posts, etc., are on this landing page on our website as well. Today's event, though, is the launch of our Local Giving by Design catalog, which has all of the information we just shared and more. Julia's going to drop the link in the chat if she hasn't already to the catalog. You can find it on our website or through this QR code here. And we will send out the link in a quick thank you note later today after the webinar, as well as the recording. And lastly, another QR code. QR codes abound in this webinar. We would love your feedback on today's webinar presentation. Julia will put the link for that also in the chat if you don't want to do it on your phone, or you can use the QR code here. It's very quick. If you could do the survey before you log off or step away to have some lunch, we would love to hear your feedback on the event so that we can make the next one even better. And with that, I think we will wrap up. Thank you all again for joining, and please be in touch with questions. I'm looking forward to talking to you all soon.